Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of By the Way to Purposeful Procurement. I'm Philip Ideson. I'm the founder and the managing director here at Art of Procurement. And I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Fine-Tune CEO, Rich Ham. Rich, thank you for joining us again today.
Happy to be here as always, Phil.
Today, really interesting conversation lined up. I've been really looking forward to this. We're going to be joined by Thomas Udesen. Thomas is a CPO of Bayer. He's been a friend of the show, of Art of Procurement, I know, for a long time. Has lots of really interesting things to say about incentive structures in procurement. And that's really where we're going to go into in today's episode. So Thomas, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here. And again, you are all doing some amazing stuff, advocating this fantastic function. So happy to support.
All right. Well, we're going to get into your work as CPO of Bayer in a few minutes, but you're also really well known for being the co-founder of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. And for those listeners who might not be familiar with that, could you just share a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so SPP, and you can find it on spp.earth, has actually been around for 5 years by now. And originally, this was just before COVID sort of hit. I remember I was inspired by a video of David Attenborough and Jane Goodall that was basically saying, how can it be that this amazingly smart species that we are, that we can be so dumb to also, destroy our own home. And I think this is where a quiet Friday evening I reflected, but we have so much power as procurement. If you think of all of us, the 1 million people around the world that do jobs like ours, we represent around 10 trillion. So basically all global trade goes through a seller and a buyer. So I wrote some philosophical notes on a LinkedIn post. I posted it Friday. And what happened was that our global community responded and saying, yes, we think there is something to do together. And we are prepared to, in a way, take this to the next level. So I spoke to Bertrand Concoré, who is my co-founder, on the Saturday morning, and we decided to create a pledge building on the UN Global Compact, where we then reached out to a lot of people and tried to have some wording that reflected our reality. So there are 5 principles, you can check it out. But really, we're trying to make sustainable procurement the default. And by now, I guess we've grown over those 5 years. We have chapters in lots of geographies, many industries, many topics. We have funding from champions, supporters. Fine-Tune also has been very, very kind to also participate and help this organization. We have 20,000 ambassadors in 146 countries. We run the World Sustainable Procurement Day. If you haven't heard about that, it's always on March 21st on Equinox. And yeah, we solve problems together.
It's amazing how it's only 5 years ago. It seems like it was only yesterday. But
I also noticed I look much older now than I did 5 years ago.
Don't we all?
Yeah, that's why these cameras are not doing us any favors. At least I feel that way. It's not just about bringing people together to kind of get behind the pledge. You also launched last year in 2024 Carbon Pricing for Procurement Initiative, and I just wonder if you could share a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, what we try to do is to, in a way, close the gaps. So we reached out to our community as we do frequently, asking, what are the everyday challenges that hasn't been solved, or where you would, in a way, crowdsource for solutions. And one of those ideas was around how do we, in a way, assign a value to carbon, and how do we make sure that it is implemented and introduced in the decision matrices of the procurement practitioners across the world. So this sort of challenge were given into the SPP community and the Scope 3 peer group. I mean, there were many people involved. Halion as well was certainly an instigator, and we reached out and said, who wants to participate? And I think since then, I don't know how many meetings of how many companies. I mean, hundreds of people got involved, and we have created a standard that's sort of SPP endorsed. Of the current best way of assigning a value of carbon, making sure it gets involved in your decision making, also figuring out how do you incentivize companies to have product carbon footprints, and how do you in a way penalize if you don't have it. So the sort of bonus malus mechanism is described. And here, this is also available on the spp.earth, where all of the content, their guides, etc., are actually made available for procurement practitioners for free, right? So it's all about for procurement, by procurement. So carbon is a big, real challenge for everybody in our community, and that's why we reacted to it.
Thomas, a few episodes ago, we spoke with a brilliant guy named Martin Chilcott, who's the founder of an organization called Manufacture 2030. And Martin made the statement, he says, whether businesses realize it or not, carbon emissions are a cost today. And he provided a number of examples of where it's just unassailable fact that emissions are a cost, whether the business incorporates emissions into their definition of the term cost or not. It's just true. And he also said, accordingly, when a business drives emissions out of its supply chain, that is savings. That is, for lack of a better word. And yet, so rarely do we see this fact woven into the way businesses define these terms, cost and savings. And I want to make sure I've got this right and that our listeners can appreciate what you're after with the carbon pricing work that you've done. It seems to me that the ambition here is to solve that, right? That's to make sure that businesses start to blend their views of money and carbon emissions by acknowledging the reality that there is a cost and that reducing emissions is a savings. Do I have that right? What would you say about that topic for our listeners?
No, I think it's true that there is, of course, a cost of carbon. Each molecule, has a cost carried to it. And we have cases where it's very obvious that you are reducing the carbon emissions, and with this, there's actually cost savings. I mean, renewable energy is an obvious one, pretty universal, right? That applies that logic. I think one of the major challenges is that some of the more quantum leap solutions will require completely new technologies, right? So where the new solution doesn't have the benefit of scale, and where the investments associated with that infrastructure, I mean, it could be hydrogen or many of these really transformative technologies, it really requires a lot of capital investment, and the scale sort of makes it, at least initially, more expensive. So to the extent that sometimes people actually who are moving into this space, they almost get a first mover disadvantage, because the lower carbon solution carries at least until scale has been reached, a premium, right? And we are trying to, in a way, overcome that for those areas where the sort of typical market mechanism doesn't necessarily help to accelerate, and where the regulators haven't, in a way, taken on the role of let's say, protecting that transition phase, then companies can do it with the sort of bonus malus that is going on. But even getting the baseline for many organizations, what is a product carbon footprint? How do you calculate that? I think that has been a topic which a lot of different players in the markets are working on. Bayer is also one of the founding companies of Together for Sustainability, the TFS initiative, where we have established the standard simply because that there was no sort of common way of doing it. So we were trying to compare apples and oranges and grapes and stuff. So here, creating the common language was important, and that's in a way what we are trying to do also with the carbon pricing, a common good way of doing it.
Along the way in that answer, Martin, Thomas, you alluded to something that we discussed with Martin in our episode a few weeks back. It was this year-over-year fixation of much of the corporate world in general, and certainly it trickles into procurement. And I asked the question to Martin in that episode. I said, if we could move to year-over-year, from year-over-year to half-decade over half-decade, how grand would the impact be on global decarbonization? And his answer was, it would be massive. I wonder what your experience has been like trying to overcome year-over-year constraints, and to what extent do you view a year-over-year mindset as a hindrance to much-needed investment in decarbonization and energy efficiency.
Yeah, no, I have to agree. It's absolutely true. And you also know that some companies, they're not even looking year over year. They're looking at quarter over quarter, right? So the reality for many is even shorter than what you're doing. And it makes it really, really hard to reconcile with this sort of long-term, slow-moving transition that we're all part of. There are also, of course, organizations, often even privately owned, where they haven't been sort of exposing themselves to the pressure of the financial markets, pulling you towards quarter and quarter. There you see bold steps, which is really more transformational. And I think that's for all of us. I mean, we making bold commitments, making sure that you also offer some sort of accountability towards the broader society. I mean, whether it's your investors, your employees, etc. I think you want to make sure that you articulate a bold commitment, and that you also make your progress or lack of progress visible, so that it keeps the pressure on. Another point, and that's in a way what SPP is also about. If your customers make it a priority, right? And we have procurement people in all our customers, across the whole value chain. By making it important, by assigning a value, by being prepared to, in a way, start shifting, even if it's a small step, but everybody makes a little step. That's what I think, in a way, it requires, right? And that willingness to join the transition with our wallets as well along the value chain. I think that's how a system change can happen.
Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and kind of take a step back and think more broadly for procurement in terms of incentive structures, because one of the things we're trying to do with this project is look at different ways that we can think about demonstrating the value and the impact that procurement professionals and procurement leaders can have beyond kind of the traditional ways of measurement. And I wonder if, it's a question both to kind of reflect on the art of the possible, but it also may come in things that you've actually been doing and have done at Bayer, is when you look at changing the ways that procurement professionals are incented away from just that savings, what are some of your thoughts in how we can do that allows us to align with some of these bigger picture initiatives, not just sustainability, but other areas of value creation that goes beyond that short term? We've got to try and save money on this deal.
Yeah. No, I agree. If I had to sort of put my wish for 3 dimensions to adjust, I think the fact that we are often sort of incentivized around own metrics that nobody other than procurement people talks about or appreciates. I mean, the savings is one like that example, right? It's completely separated from the actual performance of the company. So we talk about savings and category strategies. We don't talk about margins and market share. So I think we have in a way separated ourselves from the real operation of the company by creating metrics which in a way suggest that we are sitting on the sideline observing somebody else playing on the pitch, right? So I think definitely we need to be in the pitch. I think also quite a lot of the metrics are overly valuing the individual efforts, right, versus the teams or the actual outcomes for the organizations. And I think this is also, in a way, may not help the reality that we are all part of an ecosystem. And of course, we may all do a lot of hard work, but it may not really have an outcome. And I think twisting it towards we are also part of a team. It is about the organizational outcome more than efforts. I think that's important. And then we talked about the short-term thinking, right? Many of our metrics are dependent on how well are you doing this year. And then it does, of course, offer, I guess, opportunities for opportunistic shifting things here and there. And it doesn't serve the mission of the company at the end of the day. So those are certainly things I would love to change.
When I think about, it's interesting, Rich and I talked off camera before this episode about savings and how they're kind of we've created that metric for ourselves to justify relevancy, or in a way to feel as though we're justifying relevancy, often because the business case that was made for the investment in procurement was a very cost savings ROI based decision. So we've set that expectation up amongst the business that that's what we exist for. I wonder, when you look at from a CPO role perspective, how do we start to tell the story that the expectations of what procurement can deliver are different from being measured on savings alone? Because I feel until we're successful of doing that, and that's on us to do outwardly into the business, we're always going to be hamstrung by, you made the case based on an ROI conversation for saving money, so that's what we're going to expect you to achieve. And therefore, that's what we're going to measure you on.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of self-inflicted pain we're dealing with here. I'm of the opinion that it's completely self-invented. It's to a large extent pointless to talk about savings because it's separated from the real P&L. It's not showing really how well is the financial performance. Certainly not versus your competition. It talks often about some efforts, savings, but it doesn't talk about the real margin improvement because there are inflation, there are volumes, there's all sorts of other sort of implicators that we as procurement also need to influence. And then, of course, again, the market reality. If we are clapping ourselves on the shoulders because we've saved 2 million and all our competitions have saved 3 million, then it's probably not such a great performance that we've had. Yeah. So we are trying. We dropped savings years ago. We don't have people in a way wasting lots of energy trying to reconcile sort of the unreconcilable. But we look at actual performance. Price indexes particularly for direct materials. How well are we doing versus our ambition, versus last year, versus the market and competition where that's possible. And then for indirect, we're looking at what's the evolution of the spend, the cost percentage of indirect over sales or per employee. That there are different relative ways to assess that. But we look at the real P&L and balance sheet impact. That's what matters, not some sort of figure that we have in a way used that policy that we made up.
Thomas, I love that thought you just shared there, and you said something to me a number of weeks back that has stuck with me. One of the flaws that we've been talking about in the present system that is so commonplace is that the systems of incentive that revolve around savings allow procurement to claim victory without validation. And when I asked you a question a couple weeks ago about validation, your response was, well, if you run your business on actuals, then validation is assured. It's baked into the system. And yet you're so right that there is this disconnect between the measurement systems and actuals in so many organizations. And it seems like this is such a common sense and obvious fix that, of course, the efforts of procurement should be measured based on what actually happens, not a projection of what might happen in down the road based on an initiative. I really love that concept. But I want to circle back to the question of year over year and this fixation on the short term. How you work in a huge global conglomerate that obviously has quarter-to-quarter obligations, has year-to-year obligations to shareholders, to stakeholders, and yet it seems that you have managed to build something different. How have you overcome when you have a proposition that looks like a loser over a 12-month horizon, but a winner over a 36-month horizon, or 48 or 60? What are some strategies that you have employed that have helped you, build consensus and around doing the thing that is the smart long-term business decision, but might entail some short-term steps backward?
Right. Well, I think a lot of the traditional sort of financial planning, budget reviews, strategic planning cycles, whatever you call it, is sort of a yo-yo where there's an ambition and there's some bottom-up creation which paralyzes the organization for a very, very extended period of time. It all gets consolidated and it shows something which is maybe not ambitious enough or in a way meets the expectations of society or shareholders. And then targets or additional sort of stretch targets are being assigned and it's going up and down, up and down. Meanwhile, the resources will of course start focusing on what really makes sense. How do we actually run our business? And And that's true. There are certain use cases or business cases where the cash flow or the financial impact of doing that thing has a negative sort of impact over the next 1 2 years. This is very typical, right? When you make investments, and what we are trying to do is to aggregate the sort of financial aspiration for the overall company, for the aggregated, and then empower the organization to the most extent that's practically possible to make those trade-offs within the area of responsibility or the micro enterprises that they are part of. So we really do try to create that freedom to also move towards a aspiration, and then of course keep people accountable for to which extent do we actually deliver. Is the output, the outcomes, meeting the original business cases? And it's a different kind of, I think, also much more entrepreneurial type of conversation that you get out of that. And as a big corporation, of course, we come from a history of a lot of the more traditional practices, and we are really trying to stretch ourselves to also reimagine how can you do it in a less bureaucratic, much more entrepreneurial and fast way.
You talked about banishing the word savings altogether. That's one of those probably the historical part of the how can we move on from the past to chart a new course for procurement in the future. When you banished that idea, or at least the kind of terminology of savings, did you feel that it brought some vulnerability? Because I feel like savings is a bit of a security blanket, that we wrap around ourselves to feel as though that the rest of the business looks at us and says, yes, those guys do, have some benefit and bring some value and have some relevancy to the organization.
No, and I honestly think we've in a way created it part of our own language. We've also centered our identity a lot around this, right? For many conversations that we've had with stakeholders, the first slide talks about the savings that we've delivered, and in most cases, people are rolling their eyes because it doesn't mean anything for them. They don't see it, right? And I think we have sort of created this notion of self-worth and what is the impact that we've told ourselves that. And of course now, if you're taking that away, it does leave a void. And one of the frequent questions that we also had when we also as a leadership circle we changed the expectation was that of course financial performance is super important. In terms of cost and cash and carbon and there's all sorts of dimensions which are critical, but we want to see it implemented. We want to see the outcome. We want to see how well it's in a way moving our organization vis-a-vis our competition, and that's what we need to focus on. So get on the pitch, be part of the game. Don't sit and have opinions about how other people should do it. Get in the game.
How important is data in enabling those conversations? You talk about, for example, measuring performance against price indexes, which I think is really important because you alluded to this right at the beginning. Oftentimes we go on the victory lap because we saved a lot of money, but the market we've created that own little market for ourselves. So we're applauding us on reducing cost based on the market of one rather than the broader market of what the cost should be. And we don't have we're using an RFP or we're using a baseline cost internally as a proxy for the market, but it's because we don't have the data to tell us where the market actually is. So have you found that kind of investing in data to have a better understanding of where market truly is has enabled you to tell the story of competitiveness versus competition versus just, we saved 3% and so we did a great job?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think Bayer is a life science company. There's almost a natural appreciation of data. It's science-based. So we've invested millions, if not hundreds of millions, into data over the last couple of years. So we do benefit from having real-time transparency on all transactions, in the taxonomy, in our categories. So you will always have people who say data could be better, and that's true, but most of the time it's good enough. And if it's real time, it does allow you to have meaningful interpretations of how well are you actually doing. I think it's also very important that spend data, which is like the procurement cube, that it's easily integratable with the company's P&L, right? So that there's not two different worlds that are in a way coexisting, but it's integrated. That takes a bit of effort. And I have so much empathy for any procurement person out there who's trying to do their job really, really hard without data, at their fingertips. It's very, very difficult. I get it. And that's of course problematic, that there has been in many organizations a sort of underinvestment into the IT infrastructure. It doesn't almost matter which consultancy you talk to. If you look at the investment on the CRM side and you compare it to what has happened on the SRM side, I mean, it's like day and night, right?
Yeah.
So there's some catching up to do. And I do think, by the way, that a lot of the new startups, coming in the AI space, agentic AI, they do offer lots of hope, right? Because they can, in a way, fast forward a lot of the, let's say, failure of investment of the past.
Indeed. I want to just close the loop on this conversation of and hopefully in this future state that we're trying to build, we'll banish the term savings. But there's a guy on my team who works behind the scenes on our podcast named Dan Kreitz, and he said an interesting thing to me the other day. He says, in the P&L, there's no line item for savings. There's no line in a general ledger that says, oh, here's the savings line. No, it's just expenses. That's the actual that we're talking about here. And so when you note, Thomas, that the systems we've built within the procurement function that largely weren't necessarily procurement's inventions, and the P&L, they're just divorced. They're separate, and in the future state, if we can bring them together, obviously the function becomes more purposeful, and that would be a great thing. But I want to back up, Thomas. The answer you gave before Phil's last question, you rattled off 3 or 4 words that all began with the letter C, and it reminded me of a thing you had said where you said you'd almost kind of replaced savings with a collection of words that begin with C that really drive your team's work. Could you share those with our listeners?
Yeah, I think, if you look at it from the procurement side, right? So what's important for us? It's 6 C's, but there's actually 2 more.
6,
and I don't know why magically it all starts with a C, but it is cost, it's cash, it's the carbon, it's community, it's compliance and continuity. That's what each of us can influence every day, right? And cost is of course linked with price indexes, the volume, the specifications, the write-offs. There's a lot we can do in the cost space which fits perfectly with procurement. And cash is about inventory levels and payment terms, and so behind each of those concepts there are some very tangible data points that you can look at and say, how well do we do actually? And then if you are as an enterprise, right, you would always look at your customers and competition, right? So with those 8 A's, I think you're pretty well equipped to look at the health and to the extent is the performance of the organization, not on effort, but on real outcomes. How are we doing? So that's a simple methodology that we try to use.
And that's across multiple dimensions, which is, takes you away from that just savings focus. I'm just interested to follow up on the community. See, from a community perspective, is that local sourcing? Is it impact sourcing? Could you talk just a little bit about what that C is?
Supplier inclusion is in there, right? Social impact, that you have leadership, right? What community do we have within the organization? What community do we have outside, right? So a lot of, and I think everybody can sort of judge for themselves what's the right metric in that domain that you have. And then, in the beginning, you probably, like any metric, right? In the beginning, you start measuring activities. Are we doing it? Yes or no? And then, you move into, is a real impact. So there is a maturity curve happening behind each of these C's, depending on where the journey starts.
Thomas, one of my observations when I hear you talk about the innovative approaches that that you and your cohorts at Bayer have taken to in so many respects is that it's not so much that you have injected a bunch of new and brilliant rules. It's more that you've stripped away the bad ones, and there's something, I don't know what the opposite of the word cynical is, but whatever that is, it kind of reflects a certain belief in the quality of your team members, and that if smart people are freed up to do smart things, they will go and advance the business's interests. I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic, because you would never think, it's an oddity. You would never think that in a global pharmaceutical manufacturer, you would have an environment where there are fewer rules. You would think that would be where there would be more, layer upon layer of rules, and yet it's not the case for your team, it seems.
No, and this is of course not, let's say, it's not always been like this. I think we have over the years, we reached a point where we had, 1,300 whatever pages of rules and regulations. And we had a new CEO, Bill Anderson, joining us also a couple of years ago. And he's a firm believer in the principles of humanocracy or holocracy, where it is all about how do you, in a way, empower the organization to such an extent that decisions are really made so deep into the organization by the people closest to the world and to the work. And we sort of came up with the concept of dynamic shared ownership, DSO. Some of you may want to Google that in a way to see that, because it's a completely different philosophy. And of course, we have non-negotiables, right? Rules and regulations and principles and codes of conducts that are articulated, but they're very principled, and to the extent that you don't really have to explain it. And what we then, when this happened for the whole organization, it was not a, let's say, procurement invention, but it's something that feels very close to the ideas of procurement that we have also pursued the last couple of years. We decided to ban get rid of the policy, have a code of conduct that is together with all the other codes of conduct as an employee, and it basically says make sure that you spend the money in the best interest of the company. Don't break any rules. Make sure you understand the impact of the 6 C's, etc. And with that we basically removed all approvals, so any employee in Bayer can transact automatic PRPO for 50,000 euro, credit cards everybody can do up until 5,000. So an enormous trust is given to the individuals, and of course for procurement we are making our expertise available. We have a lot of recommendations. We made some great deals. We have some preferred suppliers that we make available, but if there are people in the organization for reasons that they know best, that they feel that they can do differently, faster and better for that context, then we're not standing in their way. We do, of course, because of all the data, we have a lot of transactional transparency. So I can see what everybody is doing, and of course we do have ex-post monitoring where we have almost like a retrospective. If we believe there is some leakage, you could have done it better, then we're also advising the colleagues around this. And if we find out, it's feedback both ways, right? If we think we have such a great category strategy and we should work with this, but nobody does that, then procurement should also reflect this. Like maybe it's not such a great strategy, right? So Phil, it offers feedback both ways.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Phil here. Probably nobody on earth has spoken with more procurement professionals than Phil Ideson. Phil, how rare is what Thomas just described, that everyone can spend the company's money?
Well, I think what's interesting is that, yes, it's a rarity, but this is where technology is taking us. When I think about the operating model, procurement operating model changes, and that's, there's lots of rabbit holes that we don't have time to go into today, but you look at, you go from procurement, it's gone from a decentralized, everyone can spend what they want, to a centralized, we're going to have all this power and control, to a center-led, we're going to kind of go a little bit hybrid, to now, well, we're going to have this invisible touch that's enabled by procurement, but essentially decentralizing everything again, but with some guardrails behind it. So you can actually understand where people are spending when they are, but you're not necessarily getting in the way of them making the most easiest of purchases. So I think that that's kind of the direction of travel from a technological point of view. But obviously, there's a lot of change management that's needed to make it happen. But I'm excited to kind of see that. Thomas's point about if people aren't using a category strategy, another rabbit hole is around rogue spend. You know, we hear this, well, the business is spending all this money on things that are not aligned with our strategy as well. That's not because the business is trying to be, you know, they're trying to be bad people. It's because your strategies aren't suiting what the business needs.
Right.
But we always look at that as being, it's a business problem, not a procurement problem.
And it's also in our word, right? Our choice of word. We talk about maverick. I mean, you know, we are the good guys, and
I know.
you are
look at them all
right?
these cowboys out there spending all this money.
The villains in the field, yes.
The villains in the, so, you know, in our whole sort of vocabulary, this has creeped in. I just want to say that of course, yes, and we also then retain now the right to say no, right? So I guess historically there would be somebody coming saying, you know, procurement, execute this. And you know, we would do it, and they would subsequently say, but procurement said it's okay. We don't do that. If it's a bad deal and we can articulate, we don't sign it. It's like, you know, you go ahead and do it on your own. Mm-hmm. So the dynamics are very different. It's not that they come to us because they have to, and the policy says that. They really come to us because they genuinely appreciate our expertise. They understand where we can have an impact, and it becomes a much more advisory, more pleasant type of conversation that we have. Nobody steals, right? I mean, the fear that all this autonomy leads to chaos, it's simply not true. There's no data that would suggest that spend is undisciplined. In fact, the exact opposite is happening. Because you have transparency, everybody knows that there's transparency to everybody.
Yeah, there's more responsibility.
So much more responsibility. So it's democratizing, you know, spend.
I have one last question that I know that we have to wrap up. As the business cycle changes, you know, I think that in procurement, we're often stuck in this hamster wheel where, you know, business is good. Let's focus on supplier relationship management. Business is bad. Let's go and take everything off the table that we gave our suppliers because we were investing in supplier relationship management, take it back out in cost. How do you protect the other 5 C's that are not cost when there's more pressure to manage cost? So that, because sometimes those things can, you know, kind of conflict. The strategies that you can use can conflict with each other.
Yeah, no, and I think that's reality. It happens in our own private life, right? I mean, if you have a month where there's not so much, you know, you have to pivot a bit and be flexible. I don't think it changes the direction. I think if you are clear on the ambition and the boldness, and you know, we talked about carbon, but I know you spend a lot around also this purposeful procurement. If that is important, then we also need to be able to sort of pivot and make a tacking. I mean, it's like, I don't know, sailing, right? You sometimes you have to tack, but it doesn't change the direction. And I think that's important. And the more data you have that can also show you progress on multiple dimensions, that gives you, you know, a good sense of we are really moving in the right direction. And yes, there are headwinds, but I think that's what procurement is about to become, and it's pretty awesome, I find.
Thomas, along those lines, and if you don't mind, I'm gonna hijack the end here and try to steal one final question, because, you know, and by the way, before I ask the question, thank you for joining us. You've been so generous with your time, and it's been a fantastic discussion that I know our listeners are going to love. But I think with you as our guest today, we have not just a guru of the procurement world and of the corporate sustainability world as it intersects with procurement, but we also have just a person who has carved a lane as an inspirational leader. And so I would like to leave our listeners with some words of inspiration from you. I've referenced a couple times back because there were some common threads with our discussion with Martin Chilcott. And when I asked him, I said, if properly unshackled, if procurement were not hindered by rules that get in the way of their being optimally purposeful, what sort of power do they have to influence? And this question was specifically around decarbonization. And he said they can be the heroes of the story. He said they can be the heroes of the story in the end. What inspirational words can you leave our audience with at the end of today's message on what purposeful procurement might look like in some future state where we've stripped away the barriers?
And I think it's happening in different degrees of intensity around the world, right? The superheroes are already, flying in different parts, and we are all at different levels of maturity. But the path is really amazing. We all live in a super dynamic world, right? Particularly right now, I think the world needs us to in a way step up and be the heartbeat of the change that is coming. And one of our superpowers is the ability to collaborate, to create sort of networks of like-minded either people or companies across industries, or people linked with themes. And this ability to, in a way, co-create or crowdsource knowledge solutions, help each other so we don't all have to carry the burden individually, I think is a genuine superpower that you typically don't see in many other functions in organizations. So I do think the sort of purposeful procurement, should become and will become also the default, and not just because we think so, but because it's really good for business, it's good for society, and it's good for the planet, right? So I think we have the unique privilege and responsibility of stepping up, and most people do.
What a great answer. And I want to encourage our listeners to visit spp.earth to learn about Thomas's work with the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. He alluded to it at the top, but my firm is proud to be a supporter of SPP. The ambition is amazing and much needed. And so, Thomas, thank you for your work with SPP, for your insights with your work at Bayer, and for your time today, Phil.
No, I just want to thank you so much. There's lots of nuggets for our listeners, but also really lots of insights as we think about how do we wrap this together as we start looking at solutions. Because ultimately, that's the goal of this series, is to be able to start demonstrating, well, these are some of the solutions to the problems and challenges that we have around incentivization. And there's lots of ideas that you brought to the table today, Thomas, so thank you.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Rich and Phil, thanks for also being so passionate about this profession of ours. The journey continues.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, Thomas.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks.